Up to this point, we've explored how Laravel handles routing, middlewares, controllers, dependency injection, views, templating with Blade, and overall application architecture structure and configuration. Now it's time to connect your application to a database and manage it using migrations. Migrations are a powerful feature in Laravel that allow you to define and evolve your database schema over time in a structured and version-controlled manner. Laravel uses the PHP data objects or PDO under the hood to interact with various databases. By default, your application's database configuration is stored in the database.php file, which is under the config directory. This file defines which database connection your app should use by default and also holds configuration details for each available connections. Laravel supports a variety of database systems out of the box, such as MySQL, SQLite, and so on. Database configuration file references the environment variables that are defined in our env file. So if we open the env file here and scroll down a little bit, we see that we have some database-related environment variables. We have the connection, host, port, database, username, and password. The connection here is basically what defines the connection that Laravel should use by default. If we go back to the database.php, we see that this environment variable is used and referenced in here, along with the rest of the environment variables. This configuration file includes the default key in here that specifies the default connection that Laravel should use. Basically, this means that the Laravel will use the MySQL connection by default because we have the DB connection environment variable defined in the env file and it's set to MySQL. If this wasn't defined, then it would use SQLite. So unless you specify a connection elsewhere, like within your queries or statements, it is going to use this connection by default that's defined in here. You can also define multiple connections if needed. So if we scroll down here, we have this connections key, and this defines list of available connections for our application. As you can see, we have one for SQLite, we have one for MySQL, and you can add more database connections here based on your application needs. For instance, you might have one connection for your main production database and another one for a specialized reporting database and so on. Each connection is defined by an array of parameters. As you can see here, you specify the driver like MySQL or SQLite, and then provide some database related parameters like the database, the host, port, username, password, and so on. You can then switch connections at runtime based on your needs. However, that's more relevant once you are actually writing queries, so for now just know that having multiple connections is flexible and not too complicated. As your application grows, you may need to improve database performance and scalability. One common technique is to use separate write and read databases. Write operations such as inserts and updates happen on a primary database server, while read operations like select queries happen on one or more read replicas. This approach helps distribute load and improve responsiveness. To configure this, you can define read and write keys within your configuration array. So for example, if we wanted to define read and write connections for our MySQL connection, we would add read and write keys within the MySQL connection array. Then inside read and write arrays, we can provide the keys with values that we want to override the values from the MySQL configuration array. Otherwise, the rest of the parameters that are not defined in here will be shared across the connections. So for example, for read, we will want to override the host. So we'll do host and then set this to an array because we can provide multiple hosts, and then Laravel will choose a random database host for each request. So we may have env db read host 1 and then env db read host 2. And then you would define these within your env file. And then for write, we would have env db write host 1. So with this configuration, basically, Laravel will automatically direct the write queries like insert, update, delete to the db write host 1, and then it will spread the read queries or the select queries across the defined read hosts in here. Laravel also provides a sticky option that we can define here. So we can set sticky to true. What it does is that it ensures that after a write operation is performed within the same request, subsequent reads will come from the primary database or whatever the database host you define here to avoid replication lag issues. Replication lag occurs when writes on the primary database haven't yet propagated to the read replicas. As a result, if an application reads from a replica before it has fully caught up, it may retrieve slightly outdated data. This delay can cause inconsistencies or confusion, especially in scenarios where data is written and then immediately read. In Laravel, enabling this sticky option helps mitigate that replication lag by directing subsequent reads within the same request to the primary or the write connection if write operation has occurred. This ensures that the most recent data is always used during that request. Now, if you were actually defining your write connection, then you would probably comment this part out or remove it because it wouldn't make sense to have that here in this case since you're defining both read and write database hosts. You could essentially, instead of having db-write host here as your environment variable, just have db-host, and that's basically your primary database that you use for writing, and then you have additional hosts for the read operations, and remove the host from here. Alright, now once we have the database connections configured, how do we actually create and manage the database tables? Well, that's where migrations come in handy. Migrations are version-controlled blueprints of your database schema. Instead of manually creating or altering tables using database administration tools, you write migration files in PHP that define changes to your schema. Then using artisan commands, you can apply these changes to your database. This approach simplifies collaboration and helps ensure that every developer on a project, as well as your production servers and your staging servers, share the same database schema structure. Laravel provides a database agnostic support that allows us to work with tables across different supported database systems. Migration files are placed under database migrations directory. So if we open database here, we have migrations directory, and we already have few of the migration files already created that come with Laravel by default. Migration files typically start with the timestamp followed by the action and the table name. These default migrations don't really start with a timestamp, but the ones that we're going to generate for our application will start with the timestamp. Something to note here is that there may be more or less migration files that come with Laravel by default depending on how you install Laravel and what starter packages you use and so on. So if your default migrations look a bit different, don't panic, it's okay. So let's open the user's migration file and dissect it a little bit. Migration files, as you can see, are just PHP classes. Well, anonymous classes to be exact, as you can see here. They extend the migration base class and define two methods, up and down. Up is the method that gets executed when we are running the migrations, and down is the method that gets executed when we are rolling back or reverting the migrations. So basically, up method defines the changes needed to add or modify tables, columns, or indexes, and down method defines how to revert those changes, rolling back the migration to a previous state. Inside the up method, you'll typically use Laravel's schema builder to create tables and columns. This method takes in two arguments, the name of the table and the closure that gets the blueprint instance as its argument. This blueprint instance can then be used to do things with your table like define columns, add indexes, and so on. You can inspect the blueprint's list of available methods as well as the schema class methods on your own and see what methods are available. You don't need to memorize these methods, just explore it to see what's available so that you have an idea what kind of methods you can call. In here, as you can see, we are creating the users table and we're creating these columns using these methods. So we have an ID which calls big increments method. If we further inspect, we see that it basically calls another method called unsigned big integer, and this kind of makes sense. It essentially is creating an unsigned big integer data type column with auto increment set to true. Then string is basically varchar, we have timestamp, and so on. Laravel has some helper methods here that help with defining columns. Like ID method that we just saw, it calls other method and then it passes some arguments, so you don't have to call that yourself and set it up. Laravel basically does that for you by just calling the ID method. Same applies to remember token, timestamps, and some other methods. Like remember token calls the string method and defines the remember token column with 100 characters. And it also sets nullable to true. Because nullable method has one parameter that's set to true by default, but you can make it not nullable by passing false. You could also add indexes, foreign keys, unique keys, and so on. As you can also see, this migration file creates multiple tables, not just one table. We have the users table, password reset tokens, and sessions. Typically, you'd have one migration per table, but sometimes you may want to group and create related tables under one migration file, like it's done in here. You can also check if table already exists or if table already has a column or an index using hasTable, hasColumn, and hasIndex methods on the schema facade. So you can then decide based on that whether you want to add an index or add a column to the table and so on. Speaking of adding columns, that's basically modifying your existing tables. So instead of creating new tables, you could also modify and update the tables. So maybe you want to add a column or drop a column or maybe modify a column. In that case, instead of calling the create method, you would call the table method. So you would do schema table. So maybe we want to make some changes to the users table. And second argument is the closure with the blueprint as an argument. And in here, you define what you want to change on the users table. So maybe you want to change the name column to have 100 characters as the maximum length. So you could do string name and pass 100 as length, and then call the change method. Now, in addition to modifying the table, you could also drop the table. So if we actually scroll down to the down method, we see that we're calling drop if exists method, which drops this table if it exists. So as you can see in our down method, we are basically reversing what was done in the up method. So we create 3 tables in the up method, and we drop the 3 tables in the down method. You could also rename the tables using the rename method. So you could do something like schema rename and pass the table name that you're changing and the table name that you want to change it to. If you wanted this migration to use a different database connection instead of the default database connection that's set in the database configuration file, then you would set the connection property on the migration here. Alright, so let's revert these things back here since we don't need the read and write connections, and let's create our first migration. Let's open the terminal. We'll do vendor bin sail shell to open our Docker container. Then we'll run php artisan make migration, followed by the name of our migration. Laravel will try to guess the action that we're trying to take as well as the table name from the migration name. For example, if we call our migration something like create transactions table, Laravel will basically parse this and assume that you want to create transactions table, and it's going to put that in the migration and fill it in for you. So if we hit enter here, we see that it has created create transactions table migration file, and it does have that timestamp. Let's open the migrations directory. We see it right here. Let's open that up. And sure enough, we see that within the up method, we have the schema create method call for the transactions table name. And in the down method, we're dropping the transactions table. Also notice the timestamp in the file name. These timestamps help Laravel determine the order of the migrations. So now we can start filling this in with the columns that we'd like our transactions table to have. As you can see, it already filled in a couple of things for us. It's creating the ID, which is the or increment unsigned big integer, and then it's creating some timestamp columns for us. If we inspect that, we see that it's creating two columns for us. One is created at, and the other one is updated at. Let's add some other columns in here. Maybe we want to store the user ID of the transaction, so we'll do table unsigned big integer user ID. And typically you'd probably set up a foreign key relationship here, and Laravel provides multiple ways of how you can do that. One way is to define the foreign key using the foreign method. So we would do something like table foreign user ID references ID on users. And then we can add the cascade on delete and update if needed. So we would do cascade on delete, cascade on update. Laravel also provides a way to combine these two lines into a single line using the foreign ID, assuming that the foreign key you are referencing to is unsigned big integer. Basically, if you're using Laravel's default ID method here to define your primary keys, then you can use the foreign ID method to define the foreign keys because it uses the unsigned big integer behind the scenes to define the column and assign the foreign key to it. So we can do something like table foreign ID, define user ID as our column, and then it will be constrained to the users table. If we inspect the foreign ID here, we see that it's adding the column definition and the type is big integer and it's unsigned set to true. It's not auto increment, and then we're setting the column name, whatever we pass in here. And it's creating this foreign ID column definition class, which essentially at the end does pretty much the same thing that we're doing in here. In fact, if we inspect that, we see that constrained here calls the references method on the table, and then this references method calls the foreign method, which then further calls references. So this right here is essentially the same thing we're doing right here. And then on gets called on that right here. So it is up to you which way you want to do it. If you're using the ID method to define your primary keys, then this is easier because it's just one line. Otherwise, you can always customize it based on your needs. But in our case, we'll just keep it as this. Also notice that we set the table here to users when calling the constraint method, but it will still work if we don't pass anything here. This is actually a nullable argument. What's going to happen is that Laravel is going to try and extract the table name based on the column name, as you can see in here. So in our case, user ID, this will be split using underscore. This will get discarded since it will use whatever is on the left and make it plural, meaning user will become users, and it's basically what the table gets set on its own. So if you're following Laravel's conventions, then a lot of these methods kind of do the work for you. That being said though, I personally prefer to specify names when I can. This way it's explicit and anyone looking at this code does not have to remember that Laravel does this magic behind the scenes. All right, next column we're going to add is the amount. So we'll do table decimal amount, and we'll store this as a length of 10, out of which 2 will be decimal points, and 2 is default here, so we don't need to pass that in. Now, this of course depends on what kind of monetary values you're storing, so decimal may not always be the right choice. You may decide to store this as integers, but please don't store them as floats. We covered that in the PHP series. If you want to know more about it, check it out. But we're going to use the decimal in this example. Then we're going to add some description to our transactions table. So we'll do string description, And we also want to add a transaction date. So we'll do table date time transaction date. Now, as you might have noticed, the timestamp method is basically creating the timestamp type for the created at and updated at columns. But the datetime method here is creating the column as the datetime type. Timestamps are generally used for tracking changes to rows or records and are often automatically updated whenever the record is modified. Meanwhile, datetime is best for specific date and time value. There are of course some other differences as well between the two types related to time zone and whatnot, but that's out of the scope of this lesson. Personally, I don't use timestamp type outside of created at, updated at, and occasionally deleted at columns when dealing with soft deletes. Which brings me to the next point, soft deletes. Soft deletes let you mark a record as deleted without actually removing it from the database, typically by setting a deleted at timestamp. This makes it possible to restore the record later if needed, rather than losing it permanently. Laravel handles the query filtering automatically by adding the where clause to exclude rows that have been soft deleted in certain cases, but we're gonna get to that in time. So don't worry about that for now, but if you wanted to define that column, you would basically use the soft deletes method call. And as you can see, this also calls the timestamp and sets the column name by default to deleted at. Alright, now that we have our migration file, let's go ahead and run it using the artisan migrate command. So we'll do php artisan migrate, hit enter. We see that it has ran our migration and it is complete. And this basically means that it has ran the up method on our create transactions table migration, which means it executed this code right here, which should have created the transactions table. We can verify and test this by checking the database table in database management tool. You can use your IDE or a separate tool like MySQL Workbench or Table Plus, or just use CLI if you wish to. I have it set up in my IDE, so I'm going to use the PHP Storms database feature to inspect our database. You can connect to your local database using the credentials from the environment file, and you may have to use the localhost as your host on one of these tools, even though in the environment file we are setting the host to MySQL. This basically is referencing to the Docker container service name, and when connecting it using a database tool, you'd set it to localhost. So let's open our database. We have 9 tables. Let's refresh this, and sure enough, we see that we have the transactions table right here. We can double click it, and we see those columns. We have the ID column, user ID, amount, description, and transaction date. As well as, if we scroll to the right, we have the created at and updated at. Now, instead of checking database directly to see which migrations have been applied, you can run the php artisan migrate status command to check the status of each migration so that you know which ones have run. So we can do php artisan migrate status, and as you can see, it is listing all 4 migrations with the status ran next to them. Sometimes you may want to see what SQL statements will be executed before actually modifying the database. In that case, you can just add the pretend option to the artisan migrate command. So we can do php artisan migrate, but instead of executing the migrate, we would do pretend. And this is just going to spit out all the SQL is going to execute, but it's not going to actually apply the migrations to the database. So if we hit enter, we're getting message nothing to migrate because everything has already been migrated. But we can roll back our last migration using the artisan migrate rollback command, and then we can run the pretend again to see the SQL statements. So we'll do php artisan migrate rollback, and that executed successfully. This basically ran the down method on our create transactions table migration, which means it should have dropped this table. And note that the rollback command will by default roll back the last batch of migrations, which means that it could potentially roll back multiple migration files. For example, when we ran the rollback, it only rolled back one migration file, but if we try to roll back again, we see that it has rolled back all the other three tables. That basically means that these three tables were created together in one migration command, and they were part of a single batch. So when you execute the rollback command, it rolls back all the migrations within that batch. Let's migrate again. We see that all the migration tables have been created. Now if we roll back again, instead of rolling back only the transactions table, it's going to roll back all of these four migration files. So if we hit enter, we see that it has rolled back all four. So that's basically what rollback means. It rolls back the last migration batch. So if we migrate again and then open a table called migrations, that's where Laravel stores the migrations it has run, we see that all of these migration records that have been created here have batch assigned to 1. So when you roll back, it basically rolls back all the migrations from the last batch. You can also roll back a specific batch if you wanted to by passing the batch option. So maybe let's set these to batch 3 and let's set these 2 to batch 2. And then maybe we wanted to roll back only the migrations from batch 2. We could do something like PHP artisan migrate rollback batch equals 2. And this is going to roll back only these two migrations because they have batch set to 2. If we refresh, we see that we only have migrations left from batch 1 and 3. Let's migrate it back. Let's refresh. Let's change all of these back to batch 1. And let's say that you want to roll back one migration or limited number of migrations instead of batches. You can pass the steps option to the rollback command. So instead of specifying the batch number, you can specify the number of steps. So we can say that, hey, let's roll back the last 2 migrations, hit enter, and it's going to roll back only the latest 2 migrations that it has executed. And this is where the timestamps come in handy. Laravel uses timestamps basically for the order of the migrations. And when you're rolling back last 2 migrations, it's rolling back the latest 2 based on these timestamps. So we have the create jobs here that ends at 2, where the other ones end at 0 and 1. So technically this is considered the latest after our migration. And that's why it has rolled back these 2 migration files. Now let's try to migrate with the pretend option to see the SQL statements before actually running them. So as you can see, the create jobs basically spits out these SQL statements that's going to be executed. And then the create transactions table migration spits out these SQL statements that is going to execute. One creates the transactions table and the other one adds the foreign key constraint. Now we can also roll back all migrations by running migrate reset command. So let's run a PHP artisan migrate. Let's refresh this. We have 4 migrations here, 2 different batches, and we can run a PHP artisan migrate reset, and this is going to roll back all the migrations, basically executing the down method for all migrations. If we comment this out, or maybe we forgot to add this drop if exists line here to drop the transactions table, what's going to happen is that the reset command is not going to drop the table because the down method doesn't have that logic. Even though when you run the reset command, it may seem like it has executed all the down methods and it has rolled back your database, but it's not actually going to drop the table. So let me show that to you. Let's run PHP artisan migrate to migrate it back, and then let's run reset. And as you can see, we're getting an error here that it cannot drop the user's table because it is referenced by a foreign key on another table by transactions user ID foreign. So this means that it hasn't dropped this transactions table because transactions table is referencing to the user ID on the users table, and we have rolled back the transactions already according to the reset command. and we are at the users table, and we're trying to drop the users table because it's executing the down method on the users migration, and it's not able to drop that table because the transactions table still exists because it hasn't dropped the transactions table. If we refresh the database here, we see that we still have the transactions table here, even though it has executed the rollback of the transactions table. So while reset may seem like a good command, it can sometimes get messy when you have many tables, many migrations, foreign keys, and so on. And sometimes you just want to start fresh without trying to figure out which migration was executed, which was not, which had the down method, which did not, and then which one has the foreign keys, which one doesn't, and all that. You sometimes just want to start fresh on your local environment. For that, Laravel provides the migrate fresh command. So to avoid things like that, we can run php artisan migrate fresh, and this simply just drops all tables from your database instead of executing the down method, and then remigrates the tables. Now, there are different opinions on the down method in Laravel community. Some say that it's not needed, some say you shouldn't have down method, and some don't care. My opinion is that you shouldn't roll back anything in production. You shouldn't be rolling back migrations because it's a risk. You could be losing some data depending on what your down method does. If you make a mistake and something needs to be rolled back, you just make another migration to fix it and run the migrate command. So you are kind of only going forward and you're never rolling back or going backward in production. The only use case I can see for down method personally is during development. So I don't fill in my down methods with a lot of logic, only basic ones like this one where it automatically generates and puts it for me when I run the make migrate command. You're not gonna see me write a large down method that undoes everything done in the up method. I'm just gonna write another migration file if there was a mistake that needs to be corrected, because rolling all of that back could have a risk of losing some important data, and I'd rather not take that risk in production or even in staging. Now, at some point, your migrations directory may become large, containing a lot of migrations. So every time you run tests, for example, you would have to run through all the migrations, and it can become annoying, especially in your pipeline builds and deployment process. Laravel thankfully provides a way to squash your migrations into a SQL file. The command for that is schema dump. So we'll do a php artisan schema dump, hit enter, and this command basically creates a schema file under the database schema directory, which contains the entire database schema. So if we open that in here, we have the schema right here, and this is our database schema. As you can see, it has the create tables and everything. We can also pass the prune option to this command to also remove the migration files after squashing them. So we can do something like this, and then it removes all the migration files, and we are only left with the schema. So when you run the migrate command, Laravel will first check if the schema file exists and run that before running any additional migrations. Once it executes the schema file, then it will move on to running the remaining migrations that were not part of the schema. Sometimes you may want to connect to your database from the command line. Of course, you can run the generic standard MySQL command to do that and pass the host and everything to it and then connect that way, or you can simply use the artisandb command. So we can do php artisandb, and this is going to connect us to our database, and then we can just run our database commands here. So let's do show databases, if I can type right. And sure enough, we have all of these. We can do use Laravel, and then we'll do show tables. And sure enough, it works. You can also inspect your databases using the dbShow and dbTable artisan commands. So we can do php artisan dbShow. This basically shows us the information about our database, like the connection, the database host port, username, number of tables, the total size, the size of each table, and so on. The dbTable command, however, allows us to inspect a specific table. So for example, we can select transactions table here, and it will give us information about this specific table. For example, the number of columns, the size, the engine, the individual columns and their information, the indexes, primary key, foreign key, and so on. We can also pass the counts option to the dbshow command to include the row counts for each of the tables. We could also inspect our database from within migration files using the schema facade. Laravel provides some methods that allow us to inspect the database. We can get tables, columns, indexes, and so on. Alright, so I think this is it for now. We covered database connections and migrations and are comfortable working with different migration commands. Next, let's actually write and run some queries. So thank you so much for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Until next time, happy coding.